This is The Sweater with Kathleen Dames. Over our 12-episode season, I will share some of my best sweater knitting techniques with you while we knit a sweater together. Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 6 of season 4 of The Sweater with Kathleen Dames. Today, I want to talk a little bit about some techniques that can help you do your knitting better. And the first one is the one that's really going to get you started, is the Provisional Two-Tail Long-Tail Cast On. And I sort of adapted this, or maybe I found this when I couldn't do the crochet Provisional Cast On, because for whatever reason, I have a grandmother who knit and another who crocheted, and I learned how to knit just barely from one grandma, and I never learned how to crochet from the other, probably because she was still busy working. And so I'm really hopeless. I can barely make a chain. It's a little better now, but when I was first starting to knit and doing things that called for provisional cast on, I tried and I could not. I just wasn't comfortable and confident enough in what I was doing. I didn't understand how to make a nice smooth chain, and I didn't really get the working into the bumps. And now, of course, I think I'm much more comfortable with those kinds of ideas, but I had already figured out this provisional two-tail long-tail cast on thing. So I can't really tell you about crochet cast-ons, but I can. Let's see, I have my working yarn in my pocket. I can tell you about a two-tail long-tail cast on with provisional yarn. And it's really great. You start off by making a slip knot with both yarns held together. And you really only need, like we'll say a 6-inch tail, which is your standard tail that you'd want kind of anyway. Make the slip knot, put it on your needle, tighten it up, and then what you want to do, get the tails out of the way, and you want to hold those two tails like you would for a regular long tail cast on, so the slingshot. And you want the waste yarn to be the lower yarn over your thumb and the working yarn to be over your index finger. And then you just do that slingshot regular long tail cast on, and you end up with your working yarn over the needle, making a stitch, and your waste yarn under the needle. You can see it a little better if there are more. But the waste yarn is here under the needle. And then cast on the correct number of stitches. Don't count the slip knot, and take it off when you reach it, whether you're knitting back along the row or joining for working in the round. Don't count that slip knot, get it out of the way. And then cut off any excess waste yarn so that you just have enough for the stitches that you're casting on. Then when you need to access those stitches again, you'll come back and you will pull the waste yarn out of the stitch, and you'll have a live stitch facing the other way, and pick it up with your needle and just continue along, pulling the waste yarn out of the stitch and putting it on your needle until you have all of your live stitches on the needle. It's really simple, tidy. I always have a bit of spare waste yarn in my notions pouch or whatever, and I just find it the easiest. Other people love to do the crochet. That's awesome. I know that when you take out the knot or whatever on the crochet, or pull it out of the last stitch, you sort of unzip it, and then you have this row of live stitches, and you just slide your needle through. So that's great for some people. For me, I could never feel like I really got the crochet enough to make that work. So that isn't what I do. But if that works for you, go right ahead. Remember that you are the boss of your knitting. There are lots of different ways to do things in knitting, which is one of the things I love about it. When someone tells you that you're doing it wrong, they may not be right. In fact, they probably aren't right. And it's their fixed mindset, as we call it in the education game. I have 3 kids who have gone through grade school. And so they talk about fixed mindset and growth mindset. And fixed mindset is, I just don't know anything. There's only this one way to do it, and I can't do it. Growth mindset is, I haven't figured it out yet. There may be more than one way to solve this problem, and I'm going to find the way that works for me, and I'm going to solve the problem. Okay, so the growth mindset, you're going to add all these skills in, you're going to become a better knitter. That is a growth mindset. You want to have a growth mindset. You are the boss. And if you figure something out that works for you, then do it, okay? Don't let somebody else tell you that you're doing it wrong. Unless, you may discover down the road that you are actually doing it wrong. But if you're still making knitted fabric, is it really such a problem? I mean, it's supposed to be a hobby. It's supposed to be fun. And for me, it's a job, but it's a job that I love. Like, it's not supposed to be this thing where you're doing it wrong and this is bad and blah, blah, blah. Like, it's knitting. It's great. It's wonderful. So just knit and get on with your enjoyment of it. Okay, so that's the first part of the provisional cast on, and I'm pointing at Jane. She's not wearing the sweater. She's wearing a new shawl design that I'm about to release called Wavery. But I'm pointing at Jane because in the pattern for Enwreathed, we start up here at the neck, and I do a provisional cast on so that you can later, if you have like a lot of yarn and you want to make it a big cowl neck or whatever, you can just you can finish the neck later. I also find that I can bind off looser than I can cast on. So I can control my bind off a little better. I want the neck to not be pulled in. And sometimes if you cast on, you make a nice smooth row of cast on stitches, but it's pretty tight. You could try going up a needle size, but that can just make it kind of sloppy, but still tight, if that makes sense. But anyway, I find that I'm better able to control the tension on that edge by binding off. So that is the other reason that I recommend provisionally casting on the collar. If you don't have that problem, then it's not a problem. You can go ahead and just cast on normally, do whatever you want to do for your collar, and then get into the short rows and stuff. So that's the first place I do a provisional cast on. And then I have discovered for me that I can do a provisional cast on for the split for the underarms. Oh, this is great. So you're working your way down. You've got this big, tube, and you need to make 2 small tubes and 1 tube in the center, and you need a connection between those tubes. And that's where you can, again, provisionally cast on. Some other top-down patterns will have you bind off the stitches for the underarm, and then when you do the sleeves, you go back and you pick up stitches out of those stitches to make the tube for the tube for the sleeve. Do I have that right? And then you still have to cast on like over. So I don't like that. And one of the things I do like about working top down and doing it this way with the provisional cast on for the underarms is that it's totally seamless. There's no Kitchener stitch at the end, and I don't mind doing Kitchener stitch. I've got it down. I'm pretty happy with how it looks, but it's kind of nice to do that provisional cast on and then to have that smooth, seamless spot at the underarms and have nothing to do but weave in some ends. So when you are provisionally casting on something in the middle of a project, it's going to feel a little weird, right? So what I do is I work over to the spot where I need to do the provisional cast on. I pick up a piece of waste yarn and I hold it. You can try knotting it to the working yarn, but I find if I just hold it tightly and again do that slingshot where the provisional yarn is over my thumb and the working yarn is over my forefinger, and I do the provisional cast on for the correct number of stitches and then drop the waste yarn, continue around the next set of stitches. Yes, and I've put some provisionally cast on and keep those over and knit along the stitches for the, it works. I promise. I'm getting a little lost in my head right now. I'm sorry. But you provisionally cast on, I promise, and you get that underarm, and you can just continue around and around the body after you've done it on both sides. and then later you come back and again you pull out the waste yarn from those stitches and expose the live stitches, and pick up your your sleeve stitches and then the underarm stitches, putting the stitch marker in the middle of those for your sleeve, and then you just work your way down and decrease. And I have to say that's still the problem for me with top down, is I find knitting each sleeve a little fiddly, because I've got the body, and for the second one I've got a body and a sleeve sort of flapping around. And when I do bottom up and I can just work a sleeve, I would do the first sleeve as my secondary gauge swatch, and I get a lot of information out of that, and I get a sleeve out of the way. I'm just working around and around on that little tube, kind of like a sock or whatever. So I do find top down sleeves fiddly, but that's just me. Excuse me. It's something I'm willing to get past, but it is something to bear in mind for how you like to work. Okay, so that is technique 1. And technique 2, which is the technique that is really sort of more the big question mark for a lot of people, is knitting color work, controlling both strands. Generally, thus far, I only do color work design where you use 2 colors in a row round. There are occasionally color work patterns that have you try and do more colors than that. And I talked about that a little in the live episode last week. And that is more complicated, obviously. Some people avoid it altogether and do Swiss darning. They sort of darn over with the third color and work that third color beforehand in just one of the other 2 colors. But today, I am going to talk about actual 2-color knitting, and 2-handed 2-color knitting is how I do it. All right, so Jane is going to hold on to what I'm working on, and this is a sleeve, bottom up. We'll see how it goes, because I also, as I have said, I find that smaller circumference stranded knitting can get a little tight. So it's just something that you need to be aware of, okay, when you're doing something that's on a smaller circumference. Okay, so I am keeping my main color, which is the cream here, in my right hand, and I've got this heathery blue, purple, whatever, in my left. And I learned right-handed knitting throwing with, literal throwing. There is a style called Irish cottage knitting where you flick the yarn back and forth with your finger. I can't do that. So, but I can pick yarn off of my left forefinger, and so that's what you do. Let's see, where am I? Okay. I am working the secondary color, the CC, with my left and picking with that, and I'm throwing the main color with my right. And so 2, 3. So that's basically 2-handed knitting. Okay, that's the first part of it. I recommend, if you don't know how to do the second hand, whichever that is, if you're a picker, I would suggest practicing throwing on just some plain stockinette. Go around and around, or back and forth, but around and around works best if you're going to be doing a lot of color knitting, because that's really it's a lot easier to do color knitting in the round. And then once you feel confident that you're getting, maybe not the same gauge, but certainly a steady gauge, it does help a lot if you manage to get the same gauge. Then you can start doing it 2-handed. Oops, that was supposed to be the master color, main color. Okay, so there's 3. The other part of color 2-handed stranded knitting is trapping colors. Now on this row, it's 3 and 3, but we're going to pretend that I have to work along. Let's say I have to do 6 cream stitches before I do the next purple stitch. So we're going to do, I've done 3, and I want to trap that second color, catch it on the back so that you don't have a float that's really long. You don't want, more than 5 stitches or 6. It depends on your gauge. It depends on a lot of things. But let's say if you have a stretch of more than 5 stitches in one color, you want to trap the other color. So what I do is I put the needle through the stitch, and instead of wrapping first, I'm going to lay that contrast color, we'll just say the contrast color, over, like between the needles, and then I'd make the stitch, and that actually catches the yarn up, and then I can just continue along and it will be trapped, and it won't show on the front. I was just checking because the row below was a blue purple stitch, but it's trapped, it's caught on the back through that purl bump, and so then it makes the float shorter, it keeps the tension more even. And then you do your next contrast color. Now, going the other direction, it's a little more complicated when you have a long stretch of your CC color. Okay, so that's 2, 3, and I'm gonna trap it now on the 4th stitch. So you have to bring your main color in between the needles, like you're going to make a stitch with that color, but you're not. And then you bring the contrast color in, because you're going to make the stitch with that. Before you finish off, before you do anything else, you bring the main color back behind the work. And it's now been trapped behind that purple stitch, funnily enough. And then I'm going to do the blue. It's really trapped there, but you have to sort of lock it in and bring the stitch in and then take it back out so it's caught. It's actually caught on the back. You aren't going to make a stitch. It won't show up on your needle. So that is the basic gist of trapping your colors. And you want to do that if you have a long stretch, because you want these nice floats to not be too long. Even if you don't have a ring, you're just your fingers and you put it through the back of some stranded knitting. If those strands are too long, you will catch your finger, catch your ring, catch your watch fob on those floats, and it will yank or break. It's just not good. So generally longer than, we'll say, 5 stitches, it's best to trap your floats, and that cuts the space between of the float, the length of the float, in half. I don't recommend trapping like every other stitch. You can, but it makes the fabric denser. And one of the great things about stranded colorwork is, we've talked about this with yarn construction before. You've got the 2 strands of yarn. You've also got the air between there, and your body heats up that air, and that's what keeps you so cozy with stranded knitting. And when you compress all that and squinch it, it stops having that insulated quality, and it just is a bunch of yarn, which is still warm, but not as warm. And it's less flexible, and it makes it kind of tight and hard. And that's not really what we want from our knitting. We want our knitting to flow and flex. That's supposed to be one of the great things about it. So that is the gist of stranded colorwork. Now, I don't have the tool, but I did mention there's a little tool. It's kind of like a piece of wire that you can put around your finger, and it has 2 little like antennae that pop up off of there, and those can hold both of your yarns. So if you are a picker and you just can't throw to save your life, you can do that and have both yarns coming over one hand, and then you just select between the 2 when you're picking which color you need. I don't know how that would work with trapping. That might be kind of awkward. So I'm afraid I can't help you there, but that's that is, it also would work on your right hand as well, I think, but that would be more cottage style. So experiment, practice, give it a shot, do the cowl, because of course that is a great place that you don't have to worry quite so much about getting gauge and about your tension, and you can just practice and work on spreading out those floats. The other thing I didn't talk about is working from the outside, and that would be popping your knitting through your tube of your needles. And let's see if I got this right. You want to make sure you're then basically going to be working on the top of your ring of knitting. And I'm working magic loop, and it's now very fiddly, and I think it got, there we go. So you just want to make sure you have the working yarn coming off of the right needle. You get your left needle here, and you're going to be doing the same thing. You're still going to be knitting. I'm going to be, hold on, got to get one more loop out here to make it magic loop. But basically, instead of working at the front of the tube like you normally do, you're kind of working at the top of the tube or at the back. But this, so here we go. I'm going to knit, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to have to pull this out anyway. But it's going to force your floats to be just physically a little bit longer as a result of being worked on the outside of the fabric. You still want to, I think as I mentioned last week in the live show, spread out the stitches a little so that there's space, and that will force your float again to be longer. You don't want to squunch up your stitches on the needle, because then it will make it too tight, and it will sort of pop those stitches forward as the floats behind are contracted. So you don't want to do that, okay? So I think that kind of covers it. I'm sure there are lots of other places where you can take a look at two-handed stranded knitting. But I hope that I've explained it pretty clearly for you in terms of what you want to be doing and about trapping. Generally, I think, no, I guess in the flowering vine pattern, you do kind of need to trap. There are some longer sections at the top and bottom of those leaves where there's a stretch of the main color, and you want to trap and carry the contrasting color along just a little bit further to get you to the next stitch. Because if you did it, I think it's at like 8 or 10 stitches at one point. If you didn't, that float would be really long, and you wouldn't be happy with it in the long run. It's harder to get good tension, and it can get caught as you're taking it on or off. So I definitely recommend trapping when it's longer than 5 stitches. And give two-handed knitting a try. It's fun. It's another great skill to master. And then if something ever happens, you have the other hand to work with, you know, or just switching back and forth gives your body a chance to recover, learn something new. It's good for your brain, discover new pathways, all that good stuff. And remember, if someone tells you you're doing it wrong and you know you're not, you know that you're doing it right, just, you know, you don't even have to tell them that they're wrong. You can just say, oh, thank you. Thank you for that information, and proceed with what you're doing, because you are the boss of your knitting. Okay, I've been doing that since I planned my first wedding. Thank you for your suggestion, your advice. I appreciate it. And, you know, tell them you expect that they're being kind, whether they are or not, and then go on with what you're doing, because you're the boss. You know what you're doing. You can make yourself happy, and that's really what's important at the end of the day when you are knitting something. Okay, so that's it for this week. I don't remember at all what I'm going to be talking about next week. I think I'm going to be talking more about the split, and so we'll have a chance to I'll show that in action. But I wanted to talk about provisional cast on stuff now for your collar if you're just getting started, or if you've gone further along, if you're already well past the the cowl. It's good to know how I did it. So I'll be back next week with more fun information, and I hope you're having a great day and happy knitting. Mwah! Bye. This is season 4 of The Sweater with Kathleen Dames, and we are knitting the wreathed pullover together. Many thanks to Bichet Bouche, Swans Island, and Manos del Uruguay for making such delicious yarns, and to Brooklyn General, Knitty City, and Swans Island Company for selling those yarns to me. Many thanks to my technical editor, my test knitter, and to you for being part of The Sweater with Kathleen Dames. To purchase the enwreathed pullover and or cowl pattern, visit kathleensdames.com/thesweater or find it on Ravelry. Remember that you get a copy of the cowl pattern if you purchase the pullover. While you're there, be sure to sign up for my newsletter so you won't miss an episode. Plus, you can always hit reply on a newsletter and ask me any questions that come up about sweater knitting. posting your progress on social media? Be sure to use the hashtags enwreathed pullover and enwreathed cowl and tag me at Kathleen Dames. If you have a chance, be sure to rate and review on iTunes, even if you watch the YouTube version of this podcast. Thanks so much for being here, and happy knitting!